Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and today I'm going to talk about Malediction, a game that I first encountered at Adepticon 2025. This was about 6 months ago, maybe a little more than that now. I played a demo of the game there in the vendor hall and was really impressed at the sort of mix of card and skirmish mechanics that are going on in the game. And I've been playing it ever since, just off and on a little bit. For people who are longtime watchers of this channel, this is a Warcry channel, which is Games Workshop's fantasy skirmish game. And I really felt the sort of DNA from Warcry in this game, except they're also bringing in a lot of other things that scratched a lot of itches in a way that I was really impressed by. So I've been playing it off and on ever since, and at this point, I feel like I've played enough games that I feel pretty excited about doing a video specifically about this game for fans of Warcry and other skirmish games. But if you come to this video from a different source, you aren't necessarily a skirmish game player, this is still going to be a welcome to Malediction video that I think a lot of different people can get something out of. So first of all, what is Malediction? And I hinted at it before, but this is a skirmish game where you have a 30-inch by 30-inch board that you play a skirmish battle on with miniatures that you can either use the standees that come in the box, or you can print them out via the STLs and just paint them yourself. And it's also a card game. Where you build decks of 30 cards and navigate certain deck building restrictions to kind of flex your creativity or your competitiveness, whichever one you please, in your own personalized deck. And the game does a really brilliant job, in my opinion, sort of marrying those two concepts. The other thing that's kind of going on in this game is the lore of the game and the sort of feel of the game is really guided along by the 8 seekers that came with the first edition of the game. They are really going to sort of dictate your play style a little bit, kind of help guide your creativity a little bit, and then also just help set the vibe of the game. There is a little bit of lore here that you can read on each of the seekers, but also their own individual play styles really introduce you into the game itself in a really useful way and a pretty evocative way for some of them. So whoever developed this game clearly played a lot of Commander and Magic the Gathering and tried to port the vibes from Commander into a sort of 1v1 skirmish format. And I think that they did a really good job. Just because this has characters and cards does not mean it feels anything at all like Underworlds in terms of the sort of way that deck building works, in terms of the way that the geometry of the game works. Just because you've seen a game that has both miniatures and cards in it does not mean that you've necessarily seen Malediction. And so throughout this video, I'm going to try to give everyone a first day concept of what to expect when they pick this game up, because I think it's a lot of fun. I've got a children's drawing here to show how you set up the game. Player agency is in every single part of the setup of the game. So both players get to start with terrain. The terrain is by faction, so you can see, the 2 teal, the 2 orange, the 2 red, the 2 blue. Each faction has a terrain set that fits with it. When you get one of the boxes, you'll have cards that give you the base and the sort of geometry of the terrain, and then you can print them out and paint them yourselves, and they'll match perfectly the little cardboard cutouts that you can use when you get the sort of intro thing. So 3D printing is a big part of the experience right now, but as I'll let you know later, there are ways to buy them straight up. But each player is going to bring 5 terrain pieces. You can choose what terrain you want. So, for example, just because you're on the red team doesn't mean you have to choose the red terrain. So you get a lot of flexibility that way. But then you're going to take turns placing down 4 of the terrain pieces. So the board is going to be a little bit different every time, and 2 different sort of players might have different ways of setting down terrain. So the board will feel really different and replayable. Then we each place 2. For people who play skirmish games, you could call them objectives. In this game, they're called husks. And each player is going to place 2 of them down. alternating. Most of the time, the husks end up in a little diamond shape, the way I've kind of drawn here, but sometimes one player decides to kind of buck the trend and put a husk like right in the middle and force the other person to kind of choose something awkward, or someone will maybe put one right in front of one deployment and kind of dare the opponent to decide whether they think they're going to win the roll-off or not. So there's all sorts of things you can do about where to put the husks, and based on where the terrain is, you'll probably make different decisions, and I think that that's really interesting. Then we each bid for initiative by choosing a card out of our hand and putting it into our discard, essentially, and whoever's got the higher value one gets to have initiative, which becomes useful in a lot of different stages. So the way you start the game is very, very much player determined, but because there's such a smooth system for it, it really doesn't take that long. There are other games, for example, I think Kill Team has a really interesting, competitively interesting game of Blind Man's Bluff that starts off the game, and it takes a very, very long time. Maledictions, I think, runs a little bit quicker, but has almost as many interesting sort of decision points. The other thing, these two smiley faces are the two deployment groups. There will be sort of a decision point at some point during the setup where you get to decide which deployment you want, and then your opponent ends up across from you. You can choose any of the four corners, and the game mat they give you is really helpful for setting up and showing you where the four corner deployments are going to be. The mission itself of Malediction is really cool. For anyone who plays Warcry, this will be familiar to you. If you're not a skirmish person, you can skip ahead 35 seconds or so. If you've ever played Extraction in Warcry, that's a mission where there are objectives and you win a treasure if you win the objective, and then the objective disappears and now you've got a fighter holding the treasure. In my opinion, it's one of the best missions in Warcry. And Malediction is just extraction all the time with a secondary kill condition. Again, it feels like they've played a lot of skirmish games to develop this game. They just took whatever the best one was and they tried to balance it out a little bit more. So we've got objective control mattering, we've got treasure protection mattering, and we've got kill points mattering. So the way you win is by getting to 40 mastery. Normally you're going to need, in order to get to 40 mastery, you're going to need to hold a couple of these for the 20-point boost or 30-point boost, and then you'll need to take out your opponent's units, and it says on each card how much each unit is worth when you take it out, and that makes for just like a really simple scorekeeping mechanism that still feels dynamic and pretty different game to game, which I think is great. The list building is another part of the game that I think is an incredible strength and part of the reason you would want to play it. Now, anyone who's played TCGs is going to understand some of this. The types of cards in each deck is going to be familiar to those people. So things like units, which you can think of as creatures, spells, there are multiple types, attachments, but there's also your specific seeker, and that seeker will have a legacy, and then you'll also have a terrain card, and those things will help define your deck. So there's a lot of different types of synergy to kind of think about. Like, for example, some units will have onboard playstyles and abilities. There are also going to be cards that sort of give you literal abilities and hoops to jump through. So there are both textual and subtextual synergies. So classic skirmish game geometry is going to work for you. For example, the Citadel crossbowman is a great archer, but you're going to have a bad time if your opponent has a really easy time closing with it. Things like that, which are not spelled out on the cards, are really important. But then other things are sort of more easy to just like read and want to build a deck around that way. So there are plenty of the kind of classic MTG synergies of, whenever you get X, get Y. There's also, every strategy game is essentially a resource management puzzle. Obviously, there's more to it in every strategy game than just that. But one thing I do like about this game is that there's a lot of different economies to kind of think about, right? There's not just things like action economy and output in a miniatures game, but there's also the echo economy. So there's a tempo to how much echo you have, which is the sort of equivalent to mana in this game. So you'll start with either 20 or 25 echo depending on your starting seeker. And then your rate of echo accumulation will start really slow and then increase as the game goes along. So this creates something where the first turn has a lot of action going on in terms of playing to the board, but there won't be a ton of fighting happening. And then as turns progress, there will be a lot more fighting as that first turn flurry of actions kind of resolves itself over the next couple turns. But you'll be a little bit echo constrained. You'll be a little bit constrained on mana, so you won't be able to do quite as many shenanigans, and it'll be a lot about how you positioned your initial forces. And then as the game progresses, your ability to pull off crazy shenanigans and strategies will increase over time. And so there's a very sort of smooth kind of tempo curve to the game that I think is really well put together, based on kind of the way these economies interact with each other, which I think is great. I think that there's a lot of different levers and knobs to kind of tinker around with as a player, and I think that that's a great time. Speaking of those cards, just to keep it simple for everyone, each card is pretty easily readable for the spells. The effect of the spells, at least right now, are generally pretty simple. The sort of things you're looking for on them are pretty simple. So on the top right, there will be just the faction symbol. Some cards have 2 factions to them, and so you'll see just like a little slash dividing them. And some cards are just single, so both of these are just single factions. The other thing is on the top left, there's this echo cost. So this one that is bronze is sort of a common, and then this gold one is rare, so you can only have 1 of Enforced Balance in your list, but you could have 3 Deadeye Archers. They have a little bit of room to make the gold cards a little bit more powerful, since you won't be able to have so many of them in your deck, and it creates, at least right now, where there are kind of only a certain number of gold cards in existence, it makes deck building have a really interesting tension to it, because you can only have so many of these cards, and because you only have so many, do you want to have a deck that is good at using all of them, or do you just want to play along a certain set of synergies that, say, you're using from your bronze cards that you're allowed to have a lot of, and that you'll have a lot more consistency of them in your deck. And so there's real tension there that I think is great in the list building phase. For spells, you just have to think about right now whether it's a swift or a channel. For units, there are a ton of different unit types, although only a couple of them are called out in terms of card synergies. So for example, Fallen are often called out. There's a few others that can matter, but most of the unit types don't matter yet. But they're still there, and I think that that's great because it, of course, allows for future design space where they can make more cards in the future that care about a unit being, for example, an abomination, which there are a bunch of abominations in this game, but no cards that care about whether something is or not. Now they've got a whole set of stuff that they could make later, and then you could just have your specific abomination deck and do something cool with that. So there's a lot of future proofing going on that I'll probably get into a little bit more later. Units can be a little bit crowded. So for example, at card size, you'll want to have good lighting. In dim light, this type of thing can be pretty frustrating. There are a lot of words on this card, but that's kind of a necessary compromise in my opinion. So in almost every skirmish game, unit profiles are printed on something much bigger than a card, or they'll have all of this elsewhere. So for example, in Warcry, they'll have a lot of different stats on there, probably just as many, but that'll take up the whole card, and then these sort of abilities are elsewhere on a separate card that you read. Here, they don't really have room for that because everything has to fit in a deck, and I think it's a worthwhile sacrifice, even though I will say, some of the units can be just a little bit crowded. Luckily, to kind of make up for that, there's a reason I don't have a whole slide devoted to combat in this game, and that's because combat itself is blessedly simple. You just roll a 1d20, and then you compare the unit stats, the number of swords versus the number of shields. So if your swords plus your roll are greater than the opponent's number of shields, then you get a hit, and you get the big number. Equal to or greater. Then you get a hit and you get the big number of their damage stat, which is right here. If it's less than their number of shields, you get a graze and it's equal to the bottom stat. And if you get a 1, no matter what, you only do 1 damage. So nothing ever fully whiffs, which does keep the game moving kind of nicely. You can't just sort of, if you like fully buff up someone defensively, they will have a lot of staying power, but you'll never be able to make something last infinitely long. Every single attack your opponent makes on it will make some progress or towards taking it down. And so it just keeps the game moving along pretty smoothly. That said, if you roll a natural 20, you get to have both the big number and the little number combined. And you feel like you're having a party. So every skirmish game, every card game has variance that matters. In Magic, did you draw your lands in the right order? In Warcry, did you avoid rolling ones and twos enough? I think that in Malediction, the sort of low lows of what can happen to you are much more smooth than in a lot of other strategy games. And the high highs are very memorable, but they are rare. But they are still there. So, for example, you can, one joke that will happen sometimes is, I drew my gold cards and you didn't draw any gold cards. Or if you roll 2 nat 20s and your opponent rolls none, it really does feel like it matters in the game. But overall, I would say the variance is a little bit less than in a lot of comparable strategy games. Now let's get into accessing those miniatures. Each of the boxes comes with a set of standees that you can just play the whole game with, and that's perfectly fine. One of the times that I demoed this at my local game store, one of our onlookers mentioned that something like Underworlds feels like you're playing a board game with miniature game pieces, and Malediction feels like you're playing a war game with board game pieces. So those standees are really good to start with, but the game is sort of deeper and more complex than I feel like the standees tell you. And so you really are going to enjoy it a lot if you just go and print out some of the miniatures or get some of the miniatures. Now, this is a very budget-friendly game if you don't do that, and the standees look pretty good for board game pieces. So, they have the whole art printed on them, and so you can totally just play them with just the standees and be happy all the time. And I'm sure there's a lot of more kind of crunchy, competitive-minded players who probably do that. But if you've got access to a 3D printer, you can get the STLs with any purchase. You get all the STLs that come with the purchase. So any standee that you would have from buying one of the box sets, you would get the STL for that standee for the corresponding miniature. But if you don't have access to a 3D printer or a 3D printing buddy, there are a couple Etsy stores that are selling the prints. And this game does get a little bit more expensive if you're doing that. It goes from being really competitive with any board game you've ever played. But if you want to sort of have all the miniatures, it becomes a little more expensive, but it's still pretty comparable to, for example, GW skirmish games. I would say it's still cheaper than Warcry. It's cheaper than Kill Team. Kill Team, you can get a fully functional Kill Team for $80 or so, which is a little bit less expensive than, say, getting all of the miniatures for, say, one of the factions, like Order of the Shattered Throne or whatever, which is what's pictured here. But if you find someone who can just print specifically the ones that you want for your deck, or if you can find something to source specific miniatures, that's going to be a little cheaper. Also, Kill Team terrain is not cheap, right? So for $111 for a terrain set, that's a pretty reasonable price, especially compared to what GW charges you. And so price-wise, this is very much comparable with any kind of skirmish game, and it is gettable on Etsy, which is great. If you like the more immersive experience of a war game, you can absolutely achieve that just going online really easily. So if you do decide to get the miniatures yourself, I figured why not do a bit of a vibe check on the different factions in this game, because I think, I started with mechanics because that is kind of how you experience and play the game, but most people choose to do their miniature shopping not necessarily based on the rules, but more based on the vibe and the minis that they're going to get. So let's get into it. The first faction that caught my eye was Conclave of the Spheres, and this is the kind of magic nerd faction, which I love because that's me, right? So there's all kinds of things that they've got, but they go into a couple groups. One is constructs and sort of flesh creatures that have been built by the mages. There's also more like golem-y constructs as well, familiars and things that a wizard might create to kind of serve them in battle. And then we've got the wizards themselves, and I've got two of them here because I just think that this range does an incredible job producing a lot of very different archetypes of what a wizard looks like in this world. So here is kind of an elf with a lot of kind of flowing. They've done a really good job doing kind of the circle motif in every little piece of the Conclave of the Spheres art. So, for example, her hood has these kind of like very like spherical circular pieces to it. Even the way her robe flows has lots of little circles cut out of it in like the negative space. She's got a ball of magic. She's got a lot of like a necklace full of baubles. The theme of spheres is kind of present in each piece of her design, even though she's also just like a pointy-eared elf wizard. So I think that that's really well done. And then here we've got sort of a human wizard with a completely different vibe. His shield has these engravings that in one person's hand could be maybe a little bit reminiscent of like a Mayan calendar. In another person's hand, it could be very almost like Tony Stark coded. Like that's kind of what they've gone for in this art. But because of kind of how the face looks, you could go a lot of different directions with this guy. I think that there's a very wide variety of kind of what a wizard can be in what the Conclave is doing, which I think is going to be great for most people kind of trying them out and deciding, what they like and what they want to mess around with. There's obviously way more wizards than just these two to pick from, and you can go a ton of different directions, which I love. Order of the Shattered Throne is a just very kind of noble knights type of faction. They've got a few different kind of crazy things, like this dude who rides the griffin is absolutely a miniature that you can print out and paint and put in your list. In fact, you'll see it in almost every single Order of the Shattered Throne list. You'll see him in there because he is very good. But I wanted to go with some of the more kind of like knightly pieces. This is a Revenant that has the kind of empty suit of armor thing going on, which I think is really cool. On the card, there's kind of like ghostly strands in there, but here you can see he's got no thigh here, or his knees are empty. Helmet is empty, which I think creates a really cool vibe, and you can do a lot of things kind of communicating that if you want to, in terms of you could put like some OSL effects or something to really sell the empty armor, something like that. And I think it also just like achieves a really awesome dynamic pose that kind of speaks to this kind of Geist-like creature is actually way more flexible in the armor than a human would be. A human wearing a ton of armor is a bit of a lumbering kind of thing going on, whereas this is a very action-packed suit of armor, which I think is really great. Then we've got this guy who's got very dwarf vibes, except on the board he's huge, so he's clearly not a dwarf. And he's just got the biggest freaking shield that you've ever seen, and his abilities on the card also kind of match that shield. And then there's this priest who is very foundational to a lot of the playstyle of the Shattered Throne. There are 3 different poses, but it's this very gothic, but not too indebted to GW kind of gothic, which I really like. They've managed to pull something together here with all of these factions that don't feel like Magic or GW ripoffs, really. They feel like a different aesthetic, but a lot of the time when you see we're going for a different aesthetic in these kind of sculpture houses, it usually ends up being either very goofy or almost so ridiculously grimdark and like very Souls-like. And they've managed to weave a path in between those two things that I think is really amazing. Getting into Legion of the Fallen, we do see the more grimdark sort of set here. You've got all kinds of different kind of necromantic creations, whether it's just like regular skeleton fighters and archers or zombies, or you've got this is Thrice Murdered, and it is absolutely terrifying on the board. It is a real problem whenever you play against the green team. I mostly just spend all of the game. They have one spell that I'm always hoping they never draw. I can't remember the name of it, but it's the one Anyway, who cares? They have one spell I'm always hoping they never draw, and then they have one creature I'm always hoping they never draw, and it's Thrice Murdered because it is so annoying to deal with. But it is really powerful and really cool. Look, a good painter can go so far with what they've got kind of here, and the way the sculpt like emphasizes the face of the miniature, and then the face being so horrific is, I think, just like a really good job composition wise. They've got kind of the triangle too with the two weapons, so the face is the top of this equilateral triangle in the composition of the miniature. And so if you do a good job painting the kind of robe over three sort of reaching skulls situation that's going up there, this is a miniature that you could enter into painting competitions, all sorts of stuff like that, just because of how much there is to kind of get into here. They've also, in Legion of the Fallen, got the various necromancers that are out here, doing the mancing. And so this miniature, I think, is really cool and speaks a lot to what's going on in the faction. That fewer of the synergies go around with these necromancers, but that's okay because they still, I think, complete the look. Lastly, we've got Primal Blood, and they are kind of a very, if you've played GW games, they're very kind of chaos coded. They've got like a lot of horrifying, this is the art that corresponds to a totem that they have that they can deploy on the board that has various powers, and it is absolutely horrifying in person. But you'll see a lot of kind of beast themed creatures or like humans. This one who's got like the incredible set of ram horns and the fur that they've tied to themselves, and the kind of bone bracer that they've got here as far as like some primitive armor. You'll also see other fighters that have like a more feathery motif, like any kind of bestial motif on a human works in their faction and looks really good and kind of ties them together. And then they mix that with just having a lot of scary monsters, human-sized monsters, but just like big freaky dogs or a really scary boar or things like that. So it's a very sort of bestial, chaotic, pagan panic, if you will, kind of thing going on for Primal Blood. And I think it's really evocative, and I think a lot of people will enjoy that. If you like a lot of chaos sculpts in any GW game, I think you'll like a lot of what Primal Blood is going for. So those are the factions, but the sort of seekers themselves are a lot of what kind of brings the vibe to the play style and on board. And so I thought I'd share half of the seekers as a close-up so that you can get a sense for what's out there, and then you'll have 4 others to explore as well. So my favorite seeker to pilot is Sigrith Andravos, and she's not the most competitive. I think most people think that Londriel is the strongest seeker. And then there's 2 seekers that are kind of near the bottom that she's not one of. And then the vast majority are like right in this middle where you can beat Londriel if you put everything together right, but it's going to be tough. And they all fight each other pretty well. Sigrith is kind of in that pack, maybe towards the bottom of the pack, but still very viable. She's awesome, though, to pilot. Like, I think that the play style is incredible. It's all about kind of creating this little battle ball of soldiers that just like rolls around the battlefield, just smushing your opponents when picking off your opponents one by one, and creating team fights only. You never want to be fighting 1v1 when you've got Sigrith. You always want to be kind of creating these group battles, and you tend to win. Like a 3v3, you'll win even if lining them up 1v1v1, you would lose, with each of those 3 fighters. So I think that that's really cool, where this is a fighter where the geometry of the board matters a lot, and how you manipulate the geometry of the board matters a lot. So it's really awesome. Your units are often giving proximity aura buffs to each other, either at 1-inch range or 6-inch range, and so guides you towards how you want to be deploying them and setting them up. And then you have this playstyle that is really aggressive, where you have to get up in your opponent's face. You don't have a lot of shooting. You only have like 1 crossbowman and a priest, but you just have a lot of fighty combat units who need to be in their opponent's face, but all of your spells are very kind of holy themed and very defensive. So it's really great where you run up to your opponent, get in their face, and then start playing defense with your shields, which I think is really great and really like it's very evocative of like a whole bunch of kind of knightly soldiers running around. Your offense kind of comes from each seeker has a legacy, which I'll show a couple more of those later in the video, but the legacy is kind of a special item that they've got that gives them more powers beyond what's just on their card, and that you just kind of pair with them. And your legacy's ability to kind of trigger bonus actions whenever you, I would say, rescue a fighter, but when it's like you fully prevent the damage to a fighter, you get to like get a bonus attack action out of them. And so you're really good at kind of creating these extra attacks with your sort of biggest fighters, as long as you are playing defense the whole time and holding up Echo to make sure that you can play defense. And so it's a very kind of it's like this kind of counter-punching bulldog where you have to like get in their face, but you aren't necessarily making the first move. You're kind of like trying to get them to hit you so that you hit them back, so that you can kind of blank a lot of their abilities. And so there's a ton of play to it that you wouldn't normally see from just like a bunch of soldiers, which I love. The other thing that Sigrith is doing a lot of is echo production. She's one of the ones that gets to start with 25 echo, which only half the seekers get to do. But your priests also produce bonus echo as long as they are placed in the center of your battle ball, which again just gives you a lot of things to think about as far as positioning, which again, coming from Warcry, I really love. This sort of seeker and the deck, the way I play it, tends to peak in the mid game, which I kind of like. Generally, if the game goes long, it's not like you don't have tools, but you lack card advantage. So you have to really make an impression during those middle turns when your echo advantage is really big, because you've had a couple turns to kind of ramp a little bit, but your cards haven't run out yet, which is, I think, a really cool like dance to kind of play, sort of not being winning right away because you haven't had time to start your ramping, but also knowing that once you are in a really advantageous position, you've got to close the game quick because you might not necessarily win like the longest of long games. So I think that the way that Sigrith kind of peaks at a certain time is a really fun kind of tension to play around with. So there's a lot going on with Sigrith, which I think is really awesome. I want to go to the two fighters that I think weaponize certain game mechanics in like the most, or sort of the most explicitly, because I think it's really interesting and shows a lot of what this game is capable of. So Vorendal the Dreadheart, I think, does the best job of all the Seekers, weaponizing like a lot of core skirmish game mechanics. Vorendal is really good at playing around with activation advantage. So on defense, Vorendal is one of the two Legion of the Fallen heroes. Actually, there's three who can use Legion of the Fallen fighters, but Vorendal is the pure Legion seeker. So he's got access to a ton of cheap bodies, because that's a lot of what Legion of the Fallen does. But Heartlock, what it does is it gives all of your Fallen minions like incredible survivability, because they all get persist. A couple of them already have persist, but all the ones that don't also have persist. So as long as you haven't activated yet, if you would get killed, you can just exhaust your unit and it just goes to 1 health. And so your opponent has to find another way to spend either a card or an action dealing with it. And so you can kind of, as long as you haven't activated yet, which you have to manipulate your activation advantage to make sure that happens, you can then sort of snowball more activation advantage that way, and you can really run your opponent out of resources in a really interesting way that, having been on the other side of Vorendal a lot, can be a little annoying. And then you get kind of the other side of action economy that you're very good at as well, which is action cheating on offense. So Vorendal himself is very good in melee. And then you also have this thing where burn spells that deal damage to your opponent's minions get to trigger bonus actions on your biggest non-Vorendal fighters. So things like there's like this big flesh ripper kind of flesh golem that Legion of the Fallen has that you can kind of do bonus actions on really easily. And so it really kind of leans into the playstyle of using your cheap fighters to kind of bait out your opponent's actions, to whittle down your opponent's resources, and then coming in with the big guys kind of late in the round to sort of weaponize the fact that you've exhausted your opponent a little bit. And this is just like classic skirmish gaming 101, and it's very effective. I think Vorendal's really good in the game, but it's also just like it's going to be so familiar to a lot of people who play these types of strategies in skirmish games, and will be a lot of fun for them. Vorendal also has a little bit of other kind of skirmish mechanic weaponization going on, in that the green team, Legion of the Fallen, gets to deploy in space, so they get to forward deploy onto their terrain. They have a few fighters that have kind of ambush abilities, and so you're really playing with the space really well, and again, you get to translate those forward deploys into essentially free move actions. So again, these Legion decks and these Vorendal players get to really maximize every little bit of kind of these classic skirmish gaming things, which is really interesting because I think it's a really cool contrast to Londriel, who I would say is the best fighter at weaponizing sort of core trading card game mechanics. Londriel is a gold fighter, so blue and yellow, or Conclave plus Order. She has a few things going on that are very, very TCG. One is she gains card advantage long-term through disruption. So basically every counterspell in your deck becomes a cryptic command when you have Londriel as your seeker, which is incredible. If anyone has played Magic and has played with a few cryptic commands in their deck, it feels really good. And Londriel is basically cryptic command the seeker. So as the game progresses, you can really bury your opponent in cards, which will eventually turn into burying your opponent in game actions eventually. However, Londriel only starts with 20 Echo, and you really do have to navigate your way through the early turns to make that card advantage matter because of the way you will be Echo constricted early on. Which I think is a really interesting way to do it. The other thing that's kind of going on here is in a very kind of blue-white control sort of way, Londriel is maybe the most imposing seeker in the game in terms of her board presence, but she's not very good at just YOLO aggression. Basically, Londriel is an untouchable porcupine. If your opponent comes and attacks her and only grazes her, she gets a free hit onto them because she is sort of a battle mage, right? She's half Order, which are all into knights, and half Conclave, which are all into wizards. So if you try to take her down and you don't hit well, she will sort of blink back onto you and make you very sad. She's got 8-inch range, so even if you're shooting at her, you can have a really tough time. And it kind of gives you the Rakdos Scam playstyle in Malediction, where for those who don't know, Rakdos Scam is just like a deck in Modern for a long time. It's now Orzhov Scam because it's now white and black instead of red and black because they banned a couple pieces from it. But you basically have this mid-range deck that has a lot of kind of regular tools that are in every kind of non-blue control deck. But then you just have these combos that can just every once in a while on turn 2 present like an absurd threat that your opponent just like might not be able to deal with. And so it's mixing a mid-range deck with like, maybe I combo kill you on turn 2, you don't know, because the combo isn't very consistent, but it's within the shell of a just very mid-rangey kind of deck going on. And Londriel does exactly that. Londriel plus the Horned Helm is the most imposing threat in the game, bar none, in my opinion. It's just absolutely absurd what Londriel can do when she's got a Horned Helm on, but you can only actually make it happen 41% of the time. So most of the time with Londriel, you won't have the Horned Helm. You have to have plans for what you're going to do in games where you don't have it, because most of the time you won't have it. But 4 out of 10 games, you'll have the Horned Helm, and then you are on a whole nother level from anything your opponent can kind of create. So again, this is a very kind of trading card game idea here of like, I want to give myself percentages, right? You're going for this, 41% of the time I'll win every time. That's not true. You can still lose if you have the Horned Helm. You can beat a Horned Helm Londriel if you're in one of the other things. You just have to play perfectly, right? But 41% of the time I'm going to have a big advantage. And then the other games, this is where I have to really play and have to really think and get myself out of scraps, right? So I think that Londriel is kind of very much weaponizing a lot of those sort of trading card game ideas in a way that I think a lot of people will really love. Also, because she's kind of cryptic command typal with what she's doing, it kind of lends itself, especially with her being kind of bad in the first 3 turns, it really lends itself to sort of classic blue-white control play that I think a lot of people love, where just figuring out how to navigate those first 3 turns and doing it quickly, because in events, if you ever play in an event, there will be a clock on you. Sort of playing those 3 turns quickly and safely, getting yourself to the part of the game that Londriel really excels in, is, I think, a really solid puzzle that I think a lot of people will enjoy. I've been getting really, really nerdy with a lot of these, so let's just get into, I think, if everything I just said about Londriel makes you want to hate the game, you will love THUNDERSTEPS, because THUNDERSTEPS is just all gas, no brakes. He has an ability that gives all of his little buddies sort of bonus damage and utility whenever they charge, which means that all of your minions are these little rocket launchers. Boneclaw Raider is a really great example of just a fighter that nothing can hide from, because you can perform a free move action and then you can charge and get a hit out. So charging has to be in a straight line, but it's a double move and attack action that you can do, which we may as well take a second now. Because charge exists, it's really nice where in Warcry, you move, attack, but to get at something far away, you have to double move onto it, and then you're very vulnerable. Whereas in Malediction, because you get the charge, where you get to double move, as long as it's in a straight line, you get to get a hit on something, you can just feel a lot better about initiating combat. It makes shooting feel a little bit less oppressive than it would in a lot of other skirmish games. And so something like the Boneclaw Raider can move once to get into position to then be able to charge. So basically nothing on the board can hide from it. THUNDERSTEPS is really good at that kind of stuff. He's also terrifying in melee himself, and he comes with a lot of just like very red vibes. So if you've played, for example, Warcry, Khorne has this ability called Blood for the Blood God, where if you get a kill, you get a free attack or a free action. And THUNDERSTEPS has that too. So he is just incredibly like, let me get in there among all of their small minions and just blow everything off the board. He can really control an area. He can actually be really annoying for Sigrith to deal with, because you're trying to create this little battle ball, and he can, on his own, kind of pick apart the battle ball because he's getting these bonus actions from getting just a single kill. So THUNDERSTEPS can be annoying when you're playing Sigrith. But he's got that kind of very kind of flailing all around, just like anti-chaff ability. But he's also got the very Magic the Gathering red game plan of being able to discard for value. He's got abilities that let you discard cards to gain kind of short-term advantages, which is incredibly red. So he's just like so aggressive all the time. And then his miniature is great. If anybody has played, again, for Warcry lovers, his miniature looks so much like a Fomaroid Crusher, and it's got a totally different set of weapons, right? Fomaroid Crushers fight with bits of buildings, but as far as like ridiculously muscular Cyclops, there's really only 2 in miniature gaming that I think are really amazing, and it's him and the Fomo Crusher. And you could probably just play your Fomo Crusher as THUNDERSTEPS. They're about the same size. They're on slightly different bases. You'd probably be fine in most casual events or most casual gameplay, but they are on a little bit different bases. But for the most part, you could just play them as each other and have a ton of fun, just like right away if you're coming from Warcry. There's also a shocking amount of list diversity in THUNDERSTEPS lists. I've seen all kinds of Thundersteps lists. I've seen ones that are like mostly minions, just hoping like I'm just gonna flood the board with dudes and then just charge all of them into you at every opportunity I can get. But I've also seen like mostly spell versions, right, where they're like I'm only going on the highest impact little howitzers, and then I'm going to use as many cards as I can to kind of give them bonus this and bonus that. And use as many spells as I can to just like focus on a few guys, because there are a lot of pretty solid combat fighters in Primal Blood. So I've also seen them be pretty balanced as well. So there's kind of a lot of list diversity, a lot of different things you can experiment with Thundersteps, which I think is really cool. The reason that I'm putting out this video today, though, is I think something very exciting. So there is a ton of design space in Malediction. That was my first impression really playing the game, was like, wow, there's a lot to explore here. I will be honest, when you are list building right now with the sort of first edition expansion sets, there's a lot of time where you'll see a theme that is hinted at, but there is not enough there to really dive in to build a deck around this theme. It's currently a little bit hard to make like janky meme lists around like synergies that are maybe not the most effective to win with, but are kind of crazy and can work, and feel like you're kind of building a house of cards. Sometimes you just don't have enough cards for the house of cards, right? But I've been feeling while playing the game that we're just a few expansions away from being in just a really incredible sweet spot. I've been telling my Discord that, by the way, the Patreon Discord, if you want to see more Warcry stuff or more Malediction stuff as this game starts getting expanded, please join. It's just $2 a month on the Patreon, or you can go into higher tiers if you want to kind of do more to support my content. But I've been saying in the Discord that I feel like Malediction is like 2 or 3 expansions away from being the best skirmish game out there, or the best fantasy skirmish game out there, like being better than Warcry. And something very exciting is happening tomorrow, which is that for the first time ever, they're going to give us a glimpse of an expansion to the game beyond what's in the very first edition of the game. And I think that that's incredible because there is so much design space to explore. And so I'm very excited to see what they think is the most pressing thing to kind of explore. There are 2 color combinations of Seekers that we haven't gotten yet. There is no Legion of the Fallen plus Order of the Shattered Throne Seeker, and there's no Primal Blood plus Conclave Seeker right now. There's kind of multicolor Seekers for Conclave plus Order, or Legion plus Conclave, or Primal Blood plus Legion, or Order plus Primal Blood. But the last 2, they aren't there. So maybe we'll see one of those new Seekers. Maybe we'll just see new sort of cards and units to play around with each of the current factions. Maybe we'll see each Seeker has their own legacy, but you could have a different legacy for each. You could have one Seeker have multiple legacies to choose from, and that would open up a whole bunch of different play styles for each Seeker, right? There's a lot of different things that they could play around with and a lot of different possibilities. And so I'm very excited for the preview show that we're going to get tomorrow. And that's why I wanted to kind of rush to get this video out, because I'm so excited. I think that there's so much awesome possibilities in this game for what could happen later on. And I can't wait to see what they explore. I think this is a game that could have a lot of staying power. I think it's going to be interesting how they handle power creep. Is this going to be a long haul type of game that wants to be around for a decade or more? Because, for example, the miniatures are a bit of an investment. One thing that happens in a lot of other skirmish games is you can do power creep really cleanly, where you have the miniature, and if something has sort of invalidated it from a competitive standpoint, you can always just kind of tinker around and release new profiles for all your miniatures. Well, that might be a little bit harder here because we're on cards. And are you going to say, like, here's a new card for this mini? I think that could work, but it would be a decision that is kind of hard to go back from, right? Because then you could have two versions of the card, like in Pokemon has this, right? Where, one individual Pokemon will have multiple versions of the card that you can play. And so I'm curious, how they'll do that, right? There's also things like with deck building restrictions and gold cards. So you can only have one of each gold card. Well, once there's a whole bunch of gold cards, are we going to cap the number of gold cards you can have per deck? Because otherwise, I wonder if a sort of two-color faction where every single one of your spells is gold, for example, because right now, that is something I notice where the two-color seekers, they have this disadvantage where they start with 5 less echo, but they also kind of have an advantage where they can have twice as many gold cards in their list. And, sometimes just the gold cards are really strong. So will decks just become way more powerful because they've got more gold cards to play with? Or is it going to be sort of capped in some way? I think that that's a lot of really interesting decisions that they can make, sort of, that are on their plate, and I can't wait to see how they handle those things. So there's a lot to look forward to, a lot to get hyped about, just in terms of new cool stuff, new cards coming out, new miniatures to print out and play. And so I can't wait to see what they do and what they think is going to be sort of important for them. So yeah, there's a lot to get excited about with this game, and I hope that other people try it. And when you do, may all your rolls be crits.